So you're going to need to tell the backend API which client apps are allowed to use it. So here I am in the conference API.java class, up where I'm specifying the endpoints API. And you'll notice that it has the client IDs. And this one here, the constants.API Explorer client ID, is the client ID for the API's Explorer. And then this one here, constants.web client ID, this is where we're specifying the client IDs of other apps, not the API's Explorer, but other web apps that are allowed to use this application. And if you knew the client ID, you could just write it out here if you wanted, but we're using this constants class to hold our web client ID. So let's take a look at the constants class. And you'll see here in the constants class that we define the client ID, and to start with there's no value, so let's replace this with your client ID. So yeah, it is a value, but it's not a real value. So you're going to need to go ahead and put your client ID in here. And just a reminder that you get your client ID in the developer's console. And the client ID includes everything. It's not just the number, it's the whole thing that you see in the developer's console up to the .com part, if you see that on yours. And you can just copy and paste the client ID from the developer's console. What we've done is that we've said that the applications with web client ID as specified are allowed to access our endpoints API. So we basically granted permission to the UI to use our endpoints. But another thing you have to do is that on the client side, on the JavaScript side, on the web app UI side, you have to, when the user logs in, you need to run the authentication process. So you need to identify yourself. So you'll need to go into the web app folder and then into the JS folder. And this time you're going to have to go to app.js. And one of the things that this file does is that it runs the authentication process when a user logs in. And you're going to need to set the appropriate client ID in here. So you can go ahead and search for client ID. And it's uppercase client -ID. And you'll see here again that the client ID is just a placeholder. So you're going to need to put your client ID right here. And again, that's the client ID that you get from the developer's console. Here it's being used for the client ID to identify itself during the authentication process. So here's my client ID. And then of course save it. And it hasn't mattered until now that the client ID wasn't set here because we haven't been using the web pages in the Conference Central application to test our functions. I think if you tried to log in using the web pages, you will have found that it didn't work because it didn't have its client ID set. Another thing you need to make sure is that your consent screen has a product name. So again, you would go to your project in the developer's console, go to APIs and auth, and then you click consent screen here, down here. And then the first thing you see is it shows you what your consent screen would look like. And this is the screen that gets shown to users when they go to use your application. And you do need to scroll down. Don't be put off that it's a little bit faded. Just go ahead and scroll down. The email address does need to have a value. And then specify a product name for your application. It's basically your application name. Okay, one last thing you need to do is to add the JavaScript cross-origin in the client application. So for this, you're going to go back to the credentials screen in the developer console. In your client ID for web application, you're going to add your JavaScript origins. So click Edit Settings. Make sure you're in the right box for JavaScript origins. And then you need to add two here. You need to add the URL for where your app is when it's running on AppSpot. And you need to add the URL for localhost. You'd go ahead and add those. For your app running on AppSpot, you do need to specify HTTPS for secure connection. For the app running on localhost, it's just HTTP because the dev server running on localhost doesn't support HTTPS. So you go ahead and you add those and you say update. And basically what this is doing is it's giving permission to these URLs to run JavaScript to access your app. And you need to do this even though this is the app itself. Right, I'm in here, my app is Cake Hut, and I'm giving permission to Cake Hut to run JavaScript to access Cake Hut. And after you've done all these things, you should find that the My Profile page works for you.